My husband, Jevon, was bent over the counter preparing dinner in the kitchen of our loft in the warehouse district when his phone suddenly buzzed. A text lit up the screen. "Baby, I miss you so much." I was only a few steps away, close enough to see every letter as clearly as if someone had whispered it right into my ear. In that moment, the whole room turned ice cold. Jevon froze but didn't touch the phone. He just stared at it. Then at me, blinking fast like he was scrambling to come up with an explanation. And it was that hesitation that told me everything I needed to know. I picked up the phone. My hand didn't tremble. I was calm, so calm it was frightening. I typed back, one word at a time. "Come over, babe. My wife's not home." Jevon spun around. The color drained from his brown skin until it went gray, like someone who had just been dragged up from the bottom of a river. He stammered, trying to say something, but it was too late. The text had already been sent, and I had already made up my mind. Not long after, the doorbell rang. A small ding, but loud enough to slice our 7-year marriage clean in half. Jevon stood there, petrified. As for me, I stared straight at him, calmer than I had ever been in my life. "My name is Layla Freeman. I'm 32 years old, a black woman living and working in New Orleans. And this is the story of how I destroyed the life of the man who betrayed me, using the very calm and intelligence he once loved me for. The moment that door opened was the moment every mask came off. If you think you know what cheating looks like, stay with me." What happened next was far more brutal than that. Our loft in the warehouse district had always been our shared pride. The ceiling was sky-high with old steel beams left exposed, the raw brick walls still bearing the scars of time. Together they created a space that was both modern and nostalgic, the essence of New Orleans. Huge windows opened out onto Magazine Street, where old oak trees draped in Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze like they were whispering their own stories. That evening, Jevon stood at the stove, stirring a pot of gumbo that was lazily bubbling. The rich smell of shrimp, andouille sausage, okra, and the dark brown roux melded together, spreading through the apartment like a warm invitation. He was wearing the navy apron I'd given him for our 3rd wedding anniversary, humming along to an old R&B song he loved. From behind, Jevon looked every bit the picture of a successful black man, earning money out there in the world, then coming home to cook dinner for his wife. He often said to me, "Making money is a man's duty, but cooking for his wife, that's a privilege." I sat at the granite kitchen island, flipping through an issue of Architectural Digest. But my mind wasn't on the pages. The warm yellow light washed over the glossy stone surface where his new iPhone lay still. The black screen was like a bottomless pit, a place holding secrets that even I, the woman who shared his bed, had never been allowed to step into. And I knew. I had known for a week. I hadn't said anything. I hadn't confronted him. I just watched quietly, like someone standing outside their own life, watching it slip out of their hands. Jevon turned around and flashed a brilliant smile. The fine laugh lines around his eyes made his face look more mature, more attractive. He asked me to taste the broth to see if it needed adjusting, then turned back to the pot again, completely absorbed, as if nothing in this world could shatter that perfect moment. Have you ever looked at the person you love and realized they no longer belong to you? That feeling isn't a loud explosion. It's a tiny crack, but it spreads fast. And if you've ever been there, you know exactly where I was in that moment, right then. Jevon's phone lit up. No ringtone, just a cold, bluish light slicing across the stone surface. Reflex made my eyes flick down to it. The words on the lock screen appeared, short, clear, merciless. Sender. Naya. Intern. Message. "Baby, I miss you so much." 5 words. I miss you so much. What turned my life upside down wasn't that sentence. It was the fact that my heart didn't hurt anymore. The real pain had already died a week earlier when I'd stood there holding his bank statement in my hand. Strange transactions. Transfers he thought I wouldn't notice. From that day on, I knew this marriage had cracked. I was just waiting to see how it would finally shatter. And this was my answer. I knew that name. Nia Burrell. The new young intern who'd joined Jevon's department at Crescent Bay Medical Center a few months back. I remembered Jevon mentioning her, praising her for being quick, polite, eager to learn. What I hadn't expected was that this eagerness to learn would extend all the way to climbing into her boss's bed. From that second on, I wasn't a wife who merely suspected. I became a woman who had seen the truth. And I started calculating. So you can understand how I managed to stay this calm, I have to tell you about the week before. It all began with something so small that even I thought I was overreacting. One Tuesday night, Jevon came home later than usual. He said he'd had dinner with clients, more specifically, hospital donors. I didn't think much of it. His job had always been demanding. But when he took off his coat, I smelled something unfamiliar. Not his usual deodorant. Not the familiar Calvin Klein cologne on his collar. It was a sweet, light, youthful scent. The kind of perfume 20-something girls wear when they're still excited to try everything new in life. I told myself, Layla, you're being paranoid. It's probably just someone's perfume who sat near him at dinner. But then other small signs began popping up. Small but steady, like puzzle pieces quietly sliding into place to form a very ugly picture. Jevon started setting his phone face down instead of face up like he used to. He took his phone into the bathroom with him, saying it was to listen to music. He would chuckle at the screen at random moments when he thought I wasn't paying attention. And most importantly, he grew distant physically. We used to be intimate at least twice a week. Over the last 2 months, that number had dropped to once every 2 weeks. And each time, I could feel he was more fulfilling a duty than actually wanting to be close to his wife. One night, after Jevon had fallen into a deep sleep, I carefully reached for his phone. The passcode was our wedding date, 15/06/2018. The irony. He used the most important day of our lives as a shield for his dirty secrets. I opened his banking app. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the transactions. Then I saw them. Transfer to Nia Burrell, $250. Lunch. Transfer to Nia Burrell, $180. Coffee and dessert. Transfer to Nia Burrell, $320. Dinner. Transfer to Nia Burrell, $1,500. Happy birthday. $1,500 for the birthday of an intern. For my birthday last year, Jevon gave me a bouquet of flowers and took me to a regular restaurant. The bill was around $120. I never complained because I'm not the kind of woman who only looks at money. But now, staring at those cold numbers on the screen, seeing that he was willing to give another woman $1,500, I felt something in my chest crack and shatter. I took screenshots, emailed them all to myself, deleted the history, put the phone back exactly where it had been. That night, I lay beside the man I had loved, trusted, built dreams with. But when I turned to look at him in the dark, all I saw was a complete stranger. If you've ever lain next to someone you love, looked at their sleeping face, and suddenly realized, this person doesn't belong to me anymore, then you know exactly how I felt that night. It's not a lightning strike. It's a terrifying stillness, like your heart has stopped even trying to cry out for help. In the days that followed, I quietly collected more evidence. I checked his iPad, the one he'd forgotten to log out of WhatsApp on. There, I read the messages between him and Nia, every word dripping with sugar. I can't stop thinking about last night's dinner. I can't either, baby. I want to see you again. Let me know when your wife's out of town, okay? I found movie tickets. November 12th, 11 p.m. showtime. That night, Jevon had told me he needed to stay late at the hospital for an emergency board meeting. In reality, he'd been sitting in a dark movie theater with another woman. I found a long, dyed brown hair stuck to the passenger seat of his car. My hair is short and black. That strand definitely wasn't mine. Every piece of evidence I found, I photographed and saved meticulously into a Google Drive folder titled Evidence, November 2024. And then I started planning. I didn't want screaming matches, smashed plates, chaotic arguments that would only give him room to deny and shift blame. I didn't want to hear a single excuse. I wanted a moment he could not talk his way out of. I wanted Jevon and his little side piece to face the real consequences of what they'd done, and I wanted that night to become the nightmare they would never forget for as long as they lived. Back to tonight. When the "I miss you so much" text popped up on the screen, I took a deep breath. Stay calm, Layla. This is it. I didn't scream. I didn't turn and confront him. The mind of a black woman in her 30s, who's had to fight through God knows how many barriers to reach where she is, does not allow her to lose control over a text message. I knew that if I exploded right then, Jevon would spit out some vaguely plausible story. She's just being childish. She sent that to the wrong person. I already told her not to talk to me like that. No, I needed more than that. I needed proof he couldn't deny. Jevon was still chopping vegetables. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board drowned out the racket of my heart pounding in my chest. I reached over and gently picked up his phone. The passcode was still our wedding date. The irony burned. I keyed in the 6 familiar numbers almost without looking. The screen unlocked, revealing the WhatsApp thread with that unread message at the top. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew enough. Instead, my fingers, cold, steady, precise, glided over the virtual keyboard. Come over, babe. My wife's not home. I hit send. As I watched the 2 blue ticks appear, a thin smile traced its way across my lips. I took a screenshot of the short exchange, sent it to myself, then wiped every trace of it from Jevon's phone. I wanted him completely clueless when the show began. If you're listening to this thinking, I'd have smashed that phone in his face and been done with it, believe me, sometimes staying quiet, preparing carefully, and striking at the right moment is far more terrifying than any screaming match. And that's the road I chose that night. I put the phone back in the exact same spot, at the exact same angle. I controlled every tiny detail. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the rage boiling up from the deepest part of my soul. I looked at Jevon's back. Still the same man, still those broad shoulders, still that devoted posture, still the guy cooking a fragrant pot of gumbo for his wife. But to me now, it was all just a disgustingly hypocritical performance. He was playing the role of the perfect husband, but his mind was no doubt off with his pretty young mistress. If he wanted so badly to perform in this farce, then I would be the director of its catastrophic final scene. I smoothed my hair, reset my expression, and pulled my usual calm composure back over my face. The storm in my chest still roared behind eyes that appeared serene, just waiting for the right moment to obliterate everything in its path. Tonight was going to be a very long night. Jevon ladled the vigorously boiling gumbo into a large serving bowl and set it carefully in the middle of the dining table. The rich smell of paprika, basil, and beef filled the entire apartment, blending with the cozy nighttime air of New Orleans. He took a cloth and wiped up every stray drop around the rim, so meticulous it used to move me to tears. Back then, a meal he cooked with that much care was all it took for me to throw my arms around him and feel like the luckiest woman alive. But tonight, looking at that pot of gumbo, all I felt was like I was staring at poison coated in sugar. He scooped me a big bowl of white rice and placed what looked like the best piece of meat on top. His voice was warm, deep, familiar. "Eat it while it's hot, baby. I simmered that meat till it falls right off the bone." He went on bragging about how he'd gone to 3 different markets just to find the best cuts of meat, just to take care of you the way you deserve. I took the bowl from his hands, trying my best not to show the slight tremor in my fingers. I picked up a piece of meat, put it in my mouth, chewed slowly. The meat was so tender it practically melted. The broth had just the right level of heat, exactly how I like it. but when I swallowed, my throat filled with a nauseating bitterness, like I was chewing ash. I had to take a big gulp of water to keep from throwing up right there at the table. I looked at the man sitting across from me. Jevon was eating heartily, occasionally placing more food into my bowl, chatting about funny things at work. He talked about a new project, about how the CEO had praised him in front of everyone, about his promotion plans for this year. But there was one thing he never mentioned, not once, the name Nia. I wondered how someone could live two lives this smoothly. To receive a "I miss you so much" text from his mistress, and just minutes later slip effortlessly into the role of a loving husband, doting on his wife. Maybe during our 6 years of marriage, he'd played this scene so many times that even I, the person next to him every single day, could no longer tell what was real and what was fake. I thought back to the early years after we got married. We'd started with nothing, in a tiny studio near Gentilly. Jevon held my hand and swore he would work non-stop so I'd never have to go without, so we could someday buy a decent place. And he had kept that promise, at least in material terms. This luxurious loft, all the comforts we now enjoyed, were proof of our shared hustle. But it seemed that as our material comfort grew, his heart began to shift. Abundance slowly made room for low desires, and the devoted wife who once split a simple sandwich with him now apparently faded in comparison to the bright young women outside. Hearing all this, you're probably asking, why doesn't Layla just flip the table, hurl the dishes, and scream in his face already? Trust me, I'd asked myself the same thing. But sometimes, quietly watching the cheater play his role to the very end is the harshest price you can make him pay when the curtain finally falls. Pretending I was full, I put down my knife and fork. I told him I was feeling a bit tired and didn't have much of an appetite. Jevon immediately looked concerned. He stood up, came around to me, and put his hand on my forehead to see if I had a fever. His palm was warm, but the second it touched my skin, a chill shot down my spine, all the way to the bone. I tilted my head just slightly to avoid that hypocritical touch, using the excuse that I was going to get more water. As I walked past the living room, I glanced up at the clock on the wall. The short hand was nearing 7, the long hand pointing straight at 12. Time crawled by with a mocking slowness. From the hospital office or her student apartment, it would take Nia somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes to get here. I wasn't going to let this golden opportunity slip away. "My wife's not home." That sentence was a stronger spell than any flirtation. When I returned to the table, Jevon had already started clearing the dishes. He told me to go rest on the couch, that he'd take care of the cleanup. Once upon a time, the image of my husband rolling up his sleeves to do the dishes was something I proudly bragged about to friends as proof of my man. Now, it was just another scene in his disgusting moral theater. I sat down on the sofa, picked up the remote, but didn't turn the TV on. My eyes were glued to the front door. My ears strained to catch the slightest sound from the hallway. Inside my head, a brutal battle was raging. Part of me still weakly hoped Nia wouldn't come, that this was all some awful joke, so I could go on lying to myself a little longer. But the other half, the colder, harsher half, ached to hear that doorbell ring as soon as possible. I wanted this pain dragged out into the light in all its rawness, because an abscess only heals after it's been lanced, no matter how permanent the scar it leaves behind. Every minute pressed down on my chest like a weight. Each tick of the second hand sounded like a countdown to judgment hour. The sound of running water in the kitchen stopped. Jevon came out, drying his hands on a towel, asking if I wanted some fruit for dessert. I shook my head and gave him a thin smile. It was probably a twisted, strained smile, but Jevon didn't notice at all. He was far too confident in his perfect version of himself. Or maybe he'd simply never cared enough about my emotional state to notice anything strange in his wife's eyes. The clock struck exactly 8 p.m. The apartment was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the second hand. Jevon sat on the sofa across from me, scrolling through the news on his phone with a completely relaxed expression. Maybe he thought this was going to be just another calm evening with his wife. Or maybe he was already planning what he'd text his mistress the moment I went to bed. He had no idea the storm was already standing on the other side of our front door. Ding dong! The doorbell sliced through the silence. It wasn't loud, but in this tightly strung space, it sounded like the opening shot of a war. Jevon flinched and looked up. Surprise and confusion flickered in his eyes. He glanced at the clock, then at the door, mumbling, "Who'd be here at this hour?" Then he turned to me as if I might know the answer. I stayed frozen on the sofa, my demeanor nearly glacial. I spoke slowly, clearly. "Sit right there. I'll get it." My voice was soft but firm, leaving him no room to argue or move. I stood up and walked toward the door. Each step on the hardwood floor sounded heavy, like a hammer driving the last nails into a coffin. My heart was racing, not from fear, but from the cold exhilaration of a predator closing a trap. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, placed my hand on the knob. I turned the lock and pulled the heavy wooden door open. Standing in front of me was a young black woman, petite, carefully made up, but still baby-faced. She wore a bodycon dress that showed off her fresh, youthful figure and held a small box of cupcakes wrapped neatly in her hands. The moment she saw me, the flirty smile starting on her lips vanished, replaced by raw panic. Her eyes went wide as saucers, pupils shrinking in fear. Her cheeks, which had been rosy, went paper white. She froze, and her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the box. She'd been expecting Jevon to open the door. In her mind, she'd probably already pictured herself leaping into his arms, cooing about how much she'd missed him. But the brutal reality was me, the woman of this house, his legal wife, standing in the doorway with eyes sharp as a blade. I didn't speak right away. I just watched, silently, as every little change flashed across that terrified face. It was that silence that made the air heavier, more suffocating than any screaming ever could. Naya stepped back half a pace. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but her throat seemed to have locked up. She flicked her gaze inside the apartment, then back at me, with the look of a thief caught red-handed. If you've ever been in a situation where the truth isn't in texts or documents anymore, but standing right in front of you, flesh and blood, then you know how horrifying that moment is. This was the moment I'd chosen. No more guessing, no more maybe. Only, this is it. I heard Jevon's footsteps behind me. "Who is it, baby? What's taking so long?" he asked. His voice only made Naya more frantic. She looked around like she was searching for an escape route, but I'd closed off every exit long before she stepped into this building. I smiled, the kind of smile that's far scarier than any shouting. Then I spoke. My voice rang out clearly, loud enough for both the man inside and the girl at the door to hear, cold and sharp as a verdict. "Hi, Nia. You here to see my husband?" My question hit Naya like a bucket of ice water thrown in her face, and at the same time, like a punch to the chest for Jevon as he approached. I saw Nia tremble. She realized instantly she'd walked straight into a trap that had been set for her, and there was no turning back. The door was open. The show had officially begun. Nia shrank in on herself like a little bird that had flown into the wrong eagle's nest. She clutched the cupcake box so tightly the knuckles of her fingers turned white. After stammering for a while, she finally managed to scrape together some flimsy excuse for showing up at this hour so inappropriately. She said she'd heard my husband was sick, and because she just happened to be passing through this area, she decided to bring him a cupcake, hoping he'd get better soon and continue mentoring her, the obedient little intern. A clumsy lie, almost pathetic. I knew perfectly well Jevon was in perfect health, and this gated complex was tucked away enough that no one ever just happens to be passing through without a reason. But I didn't expose her. The pleasure in a cat-and-mouse game isn't in killing the mouse right away, but in playing with it until it collapses from sheer panic. Keeping the thin smile on my lips, I looked straight into Nia's face as the color kept draining from it second by second. When I noticed Nia slightly turning, as if to back away, I spoke up, my voice icy. "If you take one step off this hallway, tomorrow the whole hospital, and your parents back home. We'll get photos and your messages with my husband. Go inside. We'll talk calmly, and I'll let you keep at least a shred of dignity." Nia froze, shaking. In the end, she reluctantly followed me inside. I told her that since she was already here, she might as well treat it like a chance to see the place, that the atmosphere was very cozy. I emphasized that I wanted to formally introduce her to my husband. I deliberately drew out the word husband, stamping ownership on the man who was standing there, paralyzed, behind me. Jevon had stepped into the living room. When he saw me walk in with Nia, his face crumbled even more miserably than hers. His eyes bulged, his mouth hung open, but not a sound came out. The phone in his hand slipped from his fingers and fell onto the sofa. He looked from Nia to me, his gaze whipping wildly between panic and confusion. He had no idea why Nia was standing here, and even less idea why I was calmly welcoming this guest. I led Nia to the center of the living room, sat her down in the armchair across from the big sofa, the spot where Jevon usually sat. Nia perched on the edge of the seat, back ramrod straight, knees pressed together, eyes fixed downward. I turned to Jevon and signaled for him to sit next to me. Like a soulless robot, Jevon staggered over to the sofa. Even though the thermostat was set to 75, sweat beaded on his forehead. He deliberately chose the farthest possible spot from me, as if I were a ticking bomb that could go off at any second. I began the introductions. Pointing at Nia, I told Jevon this was the talented intern he always praised, the one who had come to visit him late at night, bringing cake after hearing her boss was sick. Then I turned to introduce Jevon to Nia, calling him the most exemplary husband in the world, a man who had never once disappointed me. Every compliment I gave was a needle driven straight into Jevon's flesh. I could see him flinch. I noticed Nia glancing at Jevon with pleading eyes. She was hoping for an explanation, some comforting gesture, some look she could cling to. But all she got was cowardly avoidance. Jevon kept his head bowed, fingers twisting the hem of his shirt, not daring to open his mouth. His cowardice only intensified my contempt, and likely even Nia was starting to feel disappointed. The man who had seemed so impressive and authoritative at the office, once caught cheating, suddenly revealed himself as a pathetic man more afraid of his wife than of a lion. I stood up, saying I would go to the kitchen to get our guest something to drink. I asked Nia what she wanted, orange juice, water, or hot tea. In a voice so small it was almost inaudible, she said water was fine. I smiled and headed into the kitchen. The living room sank into a silence like a tomb. I knew that the moment I disappeared, the two of them would exchange panicked looks, but wouldn't dare speak, afraid I might hear. And that was exactly what I wanted. To let fear slowly gnaw at every corner of their minds. In the kitchen, I deliberately made noise, opening cupboards, pulling drawers, setting down cups, plates, just to remind them I was still very close, that everything they did was under my control. I opened the cupboard where we kept glasses, my hand gliding over the expensive Waterford crystal we only used for important guests. My hand stopped at the stack of thin disposable plastic cups, the kind people use at backyard barbecues or set next to a water cooler. I took one plastic cup and filled it with tap water. That choice was no accident. I wanted to belittle Nia with even the smallest details. I wanted her to understand that her place in this home, in our life, was as cheap and temporary as that cup, something you use once and throw away, something no one keeps. Carrying the tray back into the living room, I set the plastic cup of water in front of Nia. For Jevon and me, I poured tea into delicate white porcelain cups with gold rims. The contrast sat there glaring on the glass coffee table. Nia looked at the lonely plastic cup in the middle of this luxurious room, and her cheeks flushed crimson with humiliation. She understood the message. It was a wordless insult, but deep and sharp as a knife. I sat back down beside Jevon, this time intentionally close. I slipped my arm through his, resting my head on his shoulder in a tender gesture. Jevon went rigid like a wooden puppet, muscles taut with tension. Through the thin dress shirt, I could feel his heart racing wildly. Cold sweat continued to trickle down his temple. I started the conversation with fake small talk. I asked Nia how her internship was going, if Jevon was too strict with her, or if he liked teasing the pretty interns. As I spoke, I kept stroking Jevon's arm, occasionally looking up at him with loving eyes. Nia answered one word at a time, too afraid to look directly at the sweet scene playing out before her. In her eyes was a chaotic mess, jealousy, bitterness, and fear. She was being forced to watch the man she desired belong to someone else, to me, legally, completely, leaving no vacant space for a third person to wedge into. All the syrupy promises Jevon had whispered to her in private suddenly seemed small and ridiculous compared to the reality crushing her here in my living room. The air in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. Even the hum of the central air couldn't thin out the suffocating feeling clinging to the walls. If you were Nia, sitting in that armchair, facing the legal wife who holds all the cards, with the man who said he'd protect you now staring at the floor, what would you do? Would you stand up and run, or sit there, drinking water from a cheap plastic cup and pretending you still had any self-respect left? Keep your answer in mind, because this psychological game is only just beginning. Suddenly, I switched topics, turning to Jevon in a bright, enthusiastic tone. I brought up our plan to vacation in Gulfport next month. I painted an ideal future with all the enthusiasm I could muster. Blue ocean, white sand, romantic candlelit dinners. I added that we'd been looking at a lakeside cabin near Lake Pontchartrain for weekends of gardening and fishing, and that we'd started discussing caring for both sets of parents when they grew older. Every word I spoke was a blade twisting in Nia's heart. She had to see clearly that she was completely excluded from Jevon's real life. No place in the long-term plans, the assets, the future, the family. All of that belonged to us as husband and wife. In that picture, there was no room for her. She was nothing more than a passing infatuation, a toy for Jevon. Jevon sat there like a statue, neither confirming nor daring to contradict me. He looked like he was perched on burning coals, just praying this mental torture would end soon, but I had no intention of letting him off easy. I wanted tonight etched into both their memories so deeply that every time they thought of it, they'd shudder. I turned to Nia and threw her a question that sounded harmless, but every word was poisoned. Nia, a young pretty girl like you must have plenty of men chasing after you. Me, I'm getting older every day, so I have to hold on tight to this man. Just one careless moment and someone might steal him. People say these days there are needy little side chicks popping up like mushrooms after the rain. Isn't that right? Nia jolted, bowing her head, hands clenching until they turned white. The phrase, needy little side chick, shattered the last scrap of dignity she was clinging to. The air in the living room congealed. The flirty, confident woman at my door was gone, replaced by a guilty party waiting for sentencing. I had no intention of letting them get off that easily. I squeezed Jevon's hand, my nails pressing lightly through his shirt, reminding him I held all the power. My voice shifted into something sugary. Why don't you tell Nia about the cabin by Lake Pontchartrain we went to see last week? I made sure to speak loudly enough for Nia to catch every word. I told them both how much our parents liked that plot of land, how good the feng shui was, how cool it was by the lake. I emphasized that my parents had promised to chip in $15,000 toward renovations as a gift for their future grandkids. The moment I mentioned children, I felt Jevon's whole body tense. 6 years of marriage, and we'd kept postponing having kids to focus on our finances. Just as everything was finally coming together, I discovered the biggest crack in our marriage. But I still deliberately brought up children, because I knew, in any game, family is the one legitimate card a mistress like Nia can never play. I painted a picture of a family full of children's laughter. Next year is the perfect time for us to start trying. At our age, it's ideal. I'm hoping for a boy. Then I turned to Nia with a smile. What do you think, Nia? Doesn't that sound like a great plan? Nia flinched. Her spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered against the porcelain plate. the sound piercing in the silent room. She scrambled to pick it up, her face flushed red. That's a wonderful plan. I'm sure you'll be very happy." Hearing a forced blessing come out of the mouth of the woman trying to take my place was both absurd and pitiful. She'd come here hoping to carve out a spot in our life, but all she got was a clear declaration. This future does not have her name on it. Property, family, long-term plans. Together they formed a steel wall around this marriage. Someone who only had a handful of stolen dates would never break through. I kept pressing on the financial front. "Tomorrow you transfer the deposit for the house, okay? You're getting ready to sign the paperwork to put it in both our names like we discussed." The words floated out lightly, but they were a territorial claim. Jevon's assets were tied to me. If he was foolish enough to leave me, he'd lose a lot. Sweat poured off Jevon again as he nodded mechanically. He fully understood the message behind my tone. Don't be stupid enough to trade all of this for cheap thrills. The conversation about houses, money, and children seemed to drain whatever life Nia had left in her. She curled in on herself, clinging to her cup of water like a lifeline. I glanced at the flimsy plastic cup in her hands, then at my gold-rimmed porcelain cup. A cruel satisfaction rose in me as I took a sip of green tea. The tea is really good today, so smooth and fresh. Nia, want to try some? Or is your water enough? Water can be a bit bland, don't you think? My voice sounded like that of a considerate hostess, but underneath it were layers of contempt. Nia frantically shook her head. No, I'm fine. I'm thirsty. Water is enough. I don't want to make things complicated." The word complicated was almost laughable. Her very presence here was the root of all complications. I set my cup down on the glass table. The sound was sharp and dry. Looking over at Jevon, who still sat like a shadow, eyes fixed on his shoes, I decided to drag him deeper into this little play. "Since we have a guest, the man of the house should be a gentleman, right? Go peel some apples." Jevon jerked like he'd been shocked and stumbled into the kitchen. His hands shook so much the apple peel came off in jagged strips. The man who once skillfully carved flowers out of carrots now couldn't even hold a knife steady from fear. When he brought the plate of apple slices back, I leisurely speared the best-looking piece with my fork and held it up in front of his mouth. "Open up, baby. Let me feed you. Don't use your hands, they're dirty." He hesitated for a second, but still had to obediently accept it. A wife feeding her husband in front of his mistress was both an intimate display and a slap across Nia's pride. I pushed the plate of apples toward her. "Have some, Nia. They're Honeycrisp, nice and crisp and sweet." Nia looked at the piece Jevon had just eaten, then at the plate in front of her, as if her throat had closed up. How could she swallow while being forced to watch so clearly that the man she wanted still belonged to his wife, lawfully and openly? Here the boundary was drawn with the smallest gestures. I am the wife, the one with the right to love, touch, and care for him. And she, no matter what Jevon may have promised her out there, is inside this house, nothing but an intruder forced to sit and watch. Nia's eyes turned red. She was probably asking herself why she'd been stupid enough to walk into this humiliating trap. But any sympathy in me had died the moment I saw the text, "I miss you so much," on his screen. From that point on, compassion became a luxury I could not afford for anyone who set foot under my roof like that. Silence fell, heavy as the smell of gunpowder. Maybe unable to bear it any longer, Nia cleared her throat and timidly asked, "Sir, how is your stomach now? Does it still hurt? I can ask my mom to send some honey and black garlic from home. People back where I'm from use it a lot. It's really good for the stomach." Jevon's face went chalk white. He waved his hands frantically, insisting he was fine, that there was no need. He shot me a glance, knowing his mistress had just stupidly crossed the line. She had just shown she knew his private health issues far better than any normal workplace relationship would allow. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that made them both jump. "Oh, Nia, you care so much about him. The wife who sleeps next to him every night hasn't even made honey and black garlic for him. Yet you, a brand new intern of a few months, already know all about his stomach problems. Very thoughtful. I lingered on the words, the wife who sleeps next to him every night, carving the boundary in deeper. Then I turned to Jevon, my voice turning colder. And you take such careful care of your staff, huh? Next time you don't feel well, tell your wife. Don't let someone else worry, send things, bring medicine. They might start thinking your wife doesn't know how to look after you. The other night you said you were late because you had dinner with clients and your stomach hurt from the food. Now I know what kind of client dinner that was. Jevon hung his head, silent. He knew I was talking about the night he used a work dinner as a cover to go out with Nia. The clock hands pointed to 9 p.m. The cat-and-mouse game was approaching its peak. I knew it was time to land the decisive blow. I took my own phone and set it down on the table, scrolling like I was just checking notifications. I let out a deliberate sigh. These days, you open the news and it's all cheating and scandal. My friends say young girls now are bold, texting someone else's husband like he's their boyfriend, no shame at all. I paused, watching. Nia sat still, but her breathing quickened. Jevon sneaked a hand up to wipe the sweat from his forehead. I sharpened my tone. I also often help Jevon check his phone for company things. Lately I've seen a lot of strange messages, from a girl whose name alone tells you she's young, probably an intern. She sends him very affectionate texts. I glanced at Nia. Her face had gone completely white, lips trembling. I smiled, this time not bothering to hide the mockery. You know something, Nia? Just the other day, I was at home, my husband was cooking, when his phone got a message. I miss you so much. Bold, huh? Texting that while his wife is right there. What was she thinking? That she was challenging me? My words landed like a lightning strike. In Nia's eyes, I saw the exact moment she connected all the dots. The I miss you so much text, the come over babe, my wife's not home message, and the fact that tonight I'd been the one to open the door, waiting for her. She understood. Everything tonight was a trap I'd meticulously set, and she had walked straight into it. Nia began shaking uncontrollably. She looked at me like she was finally seeing the real person she had completely misjudged. Beside her, Jevon was frozen too. His eyes held a different kind of horror. He had never imagined I would not only read his messages, but be calm enough to stage an entire confrontation like this. I stared at Nia in silence. No screaming, no chaos. My silence was the harshest sentence. I had laid all the cards on the table without needing to name her crime. That was the last mercy I'd grant her, letting her figure out for herself that it was time to get out. Eventually, Nia broke. She grabbed her purse, banging it into the chair, her legs shaking so badly she almost fell. Head bowed, she stammered something about an emergency at home, that her mother had called, that she had to leave right away, sorry she couldn't stay. She didn't wait for my response, practically running for the door, leaving the cupcake box behind as evidence of her failure. Jevon stirred, maybe intending to walk her out or salvage something, but I put my hand on his thigh and squeezed hard. He understood, stayed put, only daring to watch her retreating figure disappear through the doorway. I followed her to the entryway. Nia was wobbling as she shoved her feet into her shoes, hands trembling too much to tie the laces. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. As she reached for the doorknob, I called out, "Nia!" She flinched and looked back, eyes full of fear. I stepped forward, bent my head slightly, and whispered just loud enough for the two of us to hear. "Next time you come to visit my husband, call first. If you wander around here at this hour, the neighbors might get the wrong idea that something improper is going on in this respectable home. And remember, Jevon's wife isn't always out." Nia's face went ghost white. She nodded over and over, stammering, "Yes," before bolting toward the elevator, jabbing the button like she was begging it to swallow her out of this place. Under the hallway lights, she looked small, alone, and pathetic. I stood there watching until the elevator doors slid shut. A thin smile appeared on my lips. One prey down, but the main betrayer was still sitting in my living room. I went back in and closed the door. The click of the lock sounded like the latch being drawn on a new courtroom. The victorious smile faded, replaced by a wave of nausea. I had played my part to perfection, but the price was a wound inside me that was still bleeding. I took a deep breath, put my cold mask back on, and walked into the living room. Jevon was still sitting motionless on the cream leather sofa, head bowed. The pitiful figure was worlds away from the confident, polished husband he once was. But his suffering stirred no pity in me, only deeper contempt. I picked up his phone from the table, looked at him, then suddenly slammed it down hard on the glass. Crack. The screen shattered, fractures spiderwebbing across it, the perfect image of our marriage. Jevon jumped, his face draining of color. I folded my arms and stared straight at him, my voice cold as steel. Explain. The text, "Come over, babe. My wife's not home. I'm the one who sent it." Did you think I was stupid that I didn't know anything, Jevon? His lips trembled. Baby, it was just a misunderstanding. She's only a co-worker. I was surprised she showed up tonight, too. I laughed. A co-worker? What co-worker texts, "I miss you so much" at 8 p.m.? What co-worker knows your stomach issues better than your wife does? What co-worker dares come to your home, confident that your wife's not there? You really think I can't tell the difference? I leaned down, speaking slowly and clearly. Don't treat me like an idiot. 6 years living together. I know you better than you know yourself. Then I pulled out the stack of papers I'd prepared and tossed them onto the table. Bank statements from the last 3 months. The transfers to Naya Burrell were circled. Lunches, coffees, dinners, and one glaring item, $1,500 for happy birthday. Go ahead, explain this. $1,500 for an intern's birthday. Meanwhile, for your wife's birthday, a bouquet and a basic dinner were enough. So generous. I kept going, pulling out screenshots of WhatsApp, messages arranging lunch dates, movie nights, nauseating "I miss you" lines, the late show movie tickets for the night he'd claimed he was at a client meeting, and finally, the photo of the long, dyed brown strand of hair on the passenger seat of his car. My hair is short and black. That hair most definitely wasn't mine. Backed into a corner, Jevon fell apart. He broke down in tears, begged, blamed temptation. His crying did nothing to soften me. I walked into the kitchen, picked up the pot of gumbo he'd spent all afternoon simmering, and carried it straight to the trash, dumping the whole thing in. The delicious smell collided with the stench, turning into something foul enough to make anyone gag. The love I had for you was like this gumbo. It used to be rich and precious. But once it's contaminated, it's nothing but garbage, and I don't eat garbage. The words landed like a final slap. Jevon lunged forward, wrapping his arms around my legs, sobbing, begging me not to divorce him, promising to cut things off with Naya, even to quit his job. But something inside me had gone dark. Keep what little dignity you have left. Don't be this pathetic. My decision can't be reversed. I went into the bedroom, pulled out the large suitcase I'd already prepared, and tossed in a few changes of clothes and essentials. I didn't take much, only what was truly mine. In my eyes, this apartment and every piece of furniture in it were contaminated. When I wheeled the suitcase out, Jevon was still kneeling on the floor. I placed another stack of papers on the table, the $40,000 my parents had lent us to renovate the place when we first got married, with the invoice in my father's name. These $40,000 are a clear debt. When you sell the apartment, the first thing you do is pay my parents back in full. The rest, you figure it out. The deed has both our names. I won't fight you for it. I'm leaving it to you. You can live here with whoever you want. But my parents' money, you will repay. That was the bare minimum price for what he'd done. I dragged my suitcase toward the door. Before leaving, I looked around the apartment one last time. The place that had once been our nest now looked like a grave for my love and youth. I stepped into the cool hallway. The sound of the door closing behind me was like the final brick sealing the grave of our 6-year marriage. I didn't look back. I walked toward the elevator, pulling my suitcase, each step steady. Ahead of me was a new life. It would be hard, maybe lonely, but at least it would be clean, untainted by betrayal. The Uber slid through the quiet streets late at night. I sat in the back seat, watching the streetlights pass by like blurred streaks. My mind was empty, but my chest felt lighter. I wasn't crying anymore. The tears had hardened into a cold, razor-sharp resolve. I went to Alicia's apartment, my college best friend, now a well-known divorce lawyer who specializes in brutal property disputes. When she saw me pull my suitcase down, my face hollowed out. Alicia didn't ask questions. She hugged me for a long time, then brought me inside, poured hot tea and said, "Sit down. Tell me everything." I told her everything. The message, "I miss you so much," the trap I set to lure Naya to the house, the confrontation in the living room, and the moment I pulled my suitcase and left the apartment that had once been a home. I told it with a calmness that surprised even me, as though I were describing someone else's story. After hearing it, Alicia slammed her hand on the table, swore once, then looked straight at me. "You did the right thing, absolutely right. Men who cheat don't have any excuse. And the way you handled that girl, clean, civilized, but cruel enough that she'll remember it forever." After a few sips of tea, Alicia switched into lawyer mode. She reviewed the bank statements, the messages, the screenshots, the movie tickets, then nodded. With this amount of evidence, if it went to court, I'd have a strong advantage. If Jevon refused a peaceful divorce, she was ready to represent me. But before going to court, Alicia proposed a lesson for Jevon and Naya. Don't blow this up on the internet for everyone to gossip about. Hit him where he's most afraid of losing, his career and his reputation. We began compiling all the evidence into a single PDF file. Bank statements showing he used joint funds and his company card to meet Naya, the money transfers, bills for client dinners that were actually dates, movie tickets that matched nights he said he had work meetings. Alicia organized everything, annotated dates, times, and locations, turning it into a full indictment file. Then she helped me draft an email with a cold subject line. Report of internal ethics violation and inappropriate relationship between team leader and intern. No insults, no lamenting, just sharp professional language with all evidence attached. For 2 days over the weekend, we turned off our phones and combed through every phrase and attachment. The more we polished it, the more solid I felt. On Monday morning, the sky was gray, as if signaling a storm. At 9 o'clock, when the office started checking email, I turned on my laptop. Alicia placed her hand on my shoulder. The recipient list included only the CEO, the HR director, and the department heads, the people who could determine Jevon and Nia's future. The cursor hovered over the send button. My heart raced, but it was no longer fear. It was the heartbeat of someone who knew she was closing a chapter with her own hands. I thought of Naya's stunned face at my door, of Jevon on his knees in the kitchen, of the gumbo I had dumped in the trash. Any remaining pity evaporated. "Goodbye, ex-husband," I whispered, and hit send. The sent notification appeared, short and cold. The arrow had been loosed. No one could pull it back. I leaned back and exhaled. Now it was only a matter of waiting for the storm to break over the heads of those who had chosen to trample on me. At the company, my email was like a bomb. There was no need to send it to the entire staff. A few quiet forwards were enough to spread it like wildfire. Around 10 a.m., HR called Jevon into a meeting. There, they laid out all the evidence before him: company card charges for private meals with Naya, client dinner invoices that were actually dates, expense reports that had been disguised as travel costs. Everything matched the file I had sent. These were clear ethical and financial violations. Jevon was suspended immediately, without pay, pending audit. He tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, slander, but the thick printed dossier from the PDF sat on the table and spoke for itself. 2 security guards escorted him to collect his personal items and leave the building. The team leader, once respected, now carried a box of belongings down the corridor amid curious, shocked, and slightly contemptuous stares. No suit could hide that humiliation. From Alicia's place, I received brief updates by phone. I did not feel gleeful or pitying. I only felt a sense of justice. When he had crushed our marriage to chase after novelty, he'd signed his own career's death warrant. 3 days later, the official dismissal was issued. Serious violation of professional ethics, causing damage to company reputation and trust. In HR circles, names like his get blacklisted fast. In a city that isn't that big, being fired over a scandal with a subordinate practically means every industry door will shut. Then came the financial fallout, loss of income while debts kept knocking. Car payments, mortgage payments, credit cards, loans, all turned into nooses. The monthly interest alone would steal his sleep. My phone rang constantly. The contact name, husband, flashed on the screen. I stared for a moment, then changed the contact to Layla Freeman. Just an ordinary man, no longer my husband. I didn't pick up. Calls turned into texts. First came apologies, pleas to retract the report, begging for a second chance. When my silence persisted, the tone changed to blame, calling me cruel, accusing me of destroying his life. I skimmed and deleted. Cruel? When he lay with another woman while I waited with a hot dinner, did he consider himself not cruel? When he used our shared money to buy expensive birthday gifts for his mistress, did he think about the overtime I did to add to our account? I didn't ruin his life. I only let him face the price of his choices. Even his parents in the South called. My mother-in-law sobbed and scolded, calling me a terrible wife who had destroyed her son's family, saying that men stray and women must learn to be patient. Hearing that, a bitter sadness rose in me. I replied calmly, I cannot continue living with someone who betrayed me. Then I hung up and blocked the whole family. I no longer had the energy to endure those lectures reserved for women. Jevon lost everything. A wife, family, career, reputation, financial future. He was trapped in the apartment that had once been our home, now like an invisible prison, with only his footsteps echoing off the 4 walls. It was the fairest sentence for someone who assumed the happiness he had was guaranteed. And Nia? Shortly after Jevon's suspension, HR called her in. Nia entered with puffy eyes and a hollowed face, a stark contrast to the red-lipped, confident woman who had stood at my door days before. The decision was swift. Immediate termination of her internship for violating the company's code of conduct and harming the workplace environment. Nia cried, begged for forgiveness, said she was young and had fallen into temptation, pleading for another chance. But in the corporate world, especially at large firms, an ethical stain outweighs any achievement. Worse than losing her job were the looks from others. The story, intern sleeps with a married boss and gets exposed, became gossip fodder in anonymous groups. When Nia boxed her things, no one helped. There were no comforting words. Men who once flirted with her hurriedly kept their distance so as not to be implicated. She walked down the long hallway clutching her box, her shadow stretched under the neon lights, small and alone. At the elevator, she crossed the path of a guard who had seen her run from my apartment building days earlier. His pitying look was the last straw. Nia broke down, losing whatever dignity she had left, and ran out of the building, leaving behind whispers and satisfied glances. Alicia told me that after that fall, Nia moved, locked all her social accounts, deleted glamorous photos, and disappeared from the online world. It was a steep price for a young woman who dared to gamble her youth and looks for a moment of feeling special with a married man. In the end, what she lost was the most precious thing to many women: honor and self-respect. I felt no pity for Nia. She knew he had a wife. She still texted, "I miss you so much," at 8 p.m., still brought cupcakes and smiled flirtatiously at another woman's door. Choices have consequences. I only hope that after such a painful fall, if she can manage to stand back up, she will learn to live more decently, for herself and for other women. 2 months later, we met again in court for the divorce hearing. Jevon looked as if he had aged a decade. Stubble grew uneven on his face, his shirt wrinkled, his tie loosely knotted. The man who once showed up neat and confident at fundraisers now resembled a defeated man more than a healthcare professional. He looked at me with pleading eyes, clutching at any thin hope. I remained cold and distant. The barrier between us was obvious, not only by the seating in the courtroom, but by everything that had happened. Alicia stood beside me as my attorney. Her dark suit fit perfectly, hair pulled back, her calm, sharp demeanor making Jevon even more nervous. He knew that today he faced not only the wife he had betrayed, but also a lawyer ready to do justice. In court, Jevon tried to cling. He told the judge he still loved me, that he wanted a chance to save our marriage, that it was just a momentary mistake. But Alicia wouldn't let him sweep the matter into vague territory. She presented the evidence succinctly and clearly. The transfers to Naya annotated with affectionate notes, messages arranging dinners, movies, and expressions of longing. Proof he lied about client meetings that were actually dates. Faced with such a chain of clear facts, every plea from Jevon became meaningless. The faint hope he clung to was crushed within minutes. Dividing the assets was the most tense part. Our luxurious loft in the warehouse district was our biggest asset, and Jevon's pride. Out of pride, he did not want to lose it. He couldn't bear the idea of falling from a man who owned a stylish loft to being an ordinary renter. He proposed keeping the apartment and paying my share in monthly installments. I laughed, a short, cold laugh, and shook my head. I would not allow any financial tie to bind me to that man one day longer. Alicia presented our terms. Either Jevon pays me 50% of the loft's value in a lump sum, plus $40,000 my parents spent renovating the apartment. Or we sell the apartment, pay off the mortgage, he assumes responsibility for the remaining debt, and we split the remainder according to the agreed ratio. There was no third option. Jevon's face, an unemployed man drowning in debt, went pale. He knew he could not conjure hundreds of thousands of dollars overnight. The bank had already begun foreclosure notices because he was 3 months behind on mortgage payments. The financial blade was at his throat. In the end, Jevon had no choice but to agree to sell. The apartment he once boasted about was put on the market as a rare opportunity below market value to sell quickly. After paying off the mortgage, giving me my share, and reimbursing my parents the $40,000, the amount left for Jevon was negligible. He signed the divorce papers with trembling hands. His messy signature marked the end of 6 years of marriage. When he stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, he stood alone. No house, no car. The car had been sold to pay debts. No wife, no job. A man reduced to nothing in both literal and symbolic senses. He watched the taxi that took me away in silence. The cost had been steep, but every cent of that cost resulted from the choices he made. As for me, I took my share from the sale and the division of assets. It was enough to let me start over without worrying about where I'd sleep or how I'd live. I didn't choose another large, luxurious apartment. I found a small but cozy flat in a quiet neighborhood near Magazine Street, where the trees whisper in the breeze, where I could walk to cafes and bookstores and breathe life without the shadow of the past. I decorated the new home myself. No more expensive furnishings meant to feed Jevon's vanity. Instead, soft beige tones, a few healthy plants, a wooden table, and bookshelves filled with the titles I'd bought since college. Every small corner reflected me. No longer Jevon's wife, but Layla with my own tastes and rhythm. And in that space, for the first time in a long time, I felt something clear. Peace. That evening, I invited Alicia over for a housewarming. We sat on the small balcony, cool wind in our hair, looking down at the city's scattered golden lights. Alicia raised her glass of red wine and smiled broadly. "Congratulations. I'm glad you escaped that nightmare." I smiled, feeling some knot in my chest loosen. Without Alicia's sharpness and loyalty, maybe I wouldn't have weathered the storm as firmly. My phone buzzed. A payroll notification popped up. I had just been promoted to team lead after successfully leading a major project. The demanding work, long hours, and constant meetings had inadvertently become therapy, helping me move away from painful memories. I opened Facebook and found a message from an unfamiliar account. The profile picture was a blooming sunflower. She had sent a long message thanking me. It turned out Alicia had shared my story anonymously on a women's forum, changing all names and identifying details, leaving only the core, a journey of a wife standing up for herself. A woman messaged that reading the story gave her the courage to leave her abusive, cheating husband of many years. When I read the line, "Thanks to that story, I realized I wasn't crazy. I wasn't asking for too much. I was only taking back what I deserved." A warm glow spread through my chest. Apparently, my pain wasn't just a private scar. It had become a story that could reach out to other women. If my story is a video you accidentally click at midnight, where would you see yourself in it? The one trying to forgive one more time? Or the one who has reached the limit and needs someone to whisper, "It's okay, you have the right to leave"? Ask yourself, would you choose to sacrifice more or to save yourself? I took a deep breath. The autumn air was cool, carrying the scent of greenery and the city's faint musk. The past, the nights of lies and staged performances, had been shut behind the courthouse door. Ahead of me lay a dark sky full of twinkling stars and possibilities. I am Layla Freeman. I am 32 years old. I am single. I am independent. And for the first time in a long while, I am truly happy. I took a sip of wine, a bitter top note on my tongue, followed by a sweet aftertaste sliding down my throat. It resembled my life now. Some bitterness, some grief, but after it all, the sweetness of freedom I'd sought for myself. This is my story, that of a black woman in New Orleans who pulled herself upright after the cruelest betrayal. I do not tell this story to encourage vengeance. I tell it to remind you of one thing. Your worth is never measured by how others mistreat you. If you are in a relationship that makes you doubt yourself, that forces you to justify your wounds, remember, you deserve respect. You deserve loyalty. You deserve a love that doesn't require you to humiliate yourself. And sometimes the bravest move is not staying to forgive again, but knowing when to walk away to protect your heart. Did you like this story? Where are you listening from? Tell me in the comments. If this story touched you or gave you a bit of courage, you can support me with a super thanks so I can continue bringing life stories like this. Thank you for your sweet support. I look forward to reading your thoughts on today's story. On your screen now are 2 other stories I highly recommend you watch next. There's much more content on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next life story. With all love and respect.